Perry Bacon. This is the New Republic show right now. We have a great guest today. It's Sarah J. Jackson is a University of Pennsylvania communications professor, and she has a great book out this week. The book is called Second Sight: How the Wonder and Vision of Black Media Makers Push America Toward Freedom. So, Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Perry. It's great to see you.
And obviously, this book speaks to me, and I read it. Sarah had it sent to me a few weeks ago, and so I read it. But I think it actually, because I'm a Black person in media, obviously, but I think it has resonance to readers beyond just people who work in the media or people who are Black. So I might be the target audience in a certain sense, but I think it has a broader resonance. I think it's a great book, and I'm recommending it to people. But I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I want people to actually read the book. It's called A Second Sight. It's out. It's out. Came out this week. Came out yesterday or today.
It officially came out yesterday, yeah, so very, very exciting. I'm
Can you show
still
it? Yeah,
sort of
put it
on
up a little
the
more.
the new publication high.
Do you show it? Let me bring it back again.
Yeah. So here it
Okay, that's
is.
a great
Yeah,
cover
and
too. I
the
like
the
that.
back cover, I mean, look, if you read it on a bus or a train, you really look cool because, this graphic designer did a great job on the cover for me.
So explain the concept of second sight, first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people are familiar with Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, where he talks about the experience of being Black in America as this jarring and sort of oppressive experience of self-awareness, awareness of who you are, who your community is, what your values are, etc., and then sort of the always presence of the skewed and warped vision of Blackness and of you as an individual and as of your community that comes from white supremacy, right? And that this has created what a lot of theorists took the theory of double consciousness from Du Bois and have written extensively about this. So people are probably very familiar with that. But what I have always been fascinated about is this thing that has gone less explored in Du Bois's theorization of double consciousness, where he says one of the consequences of double consciousness, which of course is the consequence of marginalization of oppression, is this profound gift called second sight. And second sight is this gift that allows African Americans to have a sort of a pulled back and expanded view of the country. Because when you're on the margins or when you're an outsider looking in, as bell hooks would later kind of frame a similar idea, you can see a more expansive picture. So you can both see and subscribe to and care about and be invested in the values, the norms of the nation, the identity of the country, and so forth. But you can also better see and better assess and better critique the gaps where the values don't come together, where there is room for improvement, where people have not yet imagined alternatives. And so Second Sight is really this sort of beautiful gift that Du Bois says results from double consciousness. And so I really wanted to explore then how, in the case of my work, because I am a media scholar and I, work on technology, media, all these other kind of media forms and the role they play in democracy in the public sphere, I really wanted to think about how that African American second sight gets built in, across generations into the stories that Black media makers like you tell.
Media makers, I want to talk about the way you define the term because I think, I initially thought the book was about journalists who work at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but you have a definition of media. We have Phyllis Wheatley, we have Ryan Coogler, we have a long tenure in terms of years and decades. We also have a very diverse definition of media. Talk about why you chose media makers as in not just sort of because you're telling a story about politics and values, but you chose media makers, not just sort of journalists. Talk about why.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so look, I mean, media, the American public sphere is fundamentally shaped, and the stories we tell about ourselves, the narratives we have about the country is fundamentally shaped by media. Journalism, of course, is core to that, right? A healthy journalistic system and democracy, should go together like this. But our public consciousness, our public politics, our public culture aren't only shaped by journalistic media, right? They're shaped by narratives at large, stories that we tell about ourselves. And one of the great examples of this in the very negative sense is the film Birth of a Nation,
Mhm.
which, for folks who are tuning in who are familiar with Birth of a Nation, Birth of a Nation was this white supremacist propaganda film, glorified the Ku Klux Klan, really helped to perpetuate in popular culture lost cause myths. And this film was extremely powerful in in normalizing those myths in the culture. And in fact, there's some research that shows that it also directly caused violence against Black communities in areas where it was released and shown at the time. And so what we know is that journalism and these other forms of media work hand in hand. Filmmaking, and as you mentioned in the book, I talk about slave narratives and literature, because people forget that the printing press was a form of revolutionary technology, right? We're all living in an era where we think of the internet as our era's form of revolutionary technology. But at one period, the printing press was a revolutionary technology that made it possible to circulate media, circulate ideas, whether those were newspapers or pamphlets, or books of poetry. In another era, photography was the revolutionary media, and that was the media that was really helping people reimagine and envision what America looked like, right? And so Black media makers were engaged in intervening in photographic technologies, and so film, podcast, right, journalism, all these things. This is why I use the scope and the framework of media making, because you can really see how they speak and talk to each other.
The book is organized not chronologically, but in some ways in these three ideas where the second sight. So let's talk about those. The second sight you first give, Black media is a second sight to the use the term life. Explain what you mean by life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to jump ahead from your question a little bit.
Sure.
When people get their hands on the book, which I hope they will, they'll see that the three core chapters of the book are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we know these ideas by heart, we think, because they come from the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we're a couple weeks out from the semi-sesquicentennial, which nobody wants to say, but it's the 250th anniversary of the first 4th of July. Um, and I sandwich those three values between these, Black theoretical concepts of second sight, and Sankofa, which is a West African ideal of that you must look back to look forward. You must understand the past in order to imagine the future. And so, really, what I'm trying to do by engaging life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the book is think about how we might reimagine those ideals, those ideas through the second sight of Black media making over the course of time. And so, as you know, in the life chapter, I take up stories from across different historical contexts that Black media makers were telling about what American life could be, right? If its values were really adhered to, right, and embraced, and what American life was, and how life was or wasn't, valued. And that's one of the chapters where, as you know, I talk a lot about the struggle of Black journalists, to really make everyone's lives matter in this country in terms of being able to tell those stories. But I do that. I do a similar thing also, of course, with liberty and with the pursuit of happiness.
And the pursuit of happiness, you talk about that chapter a little bit now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the more fun chapters to write, because there's a lot of the imagination stuff comes up in that chapter. I got to write about the film school, the LA film school called the LA Rebellion, that include folks like Julie Dash, who is an incredible and very influential filmmaker who made a film called Daughters of the Dust, where she uses sort of speculative futurity to tell a multi-generational story. In that chapter, I get to talk about things like Octavia Butler's writing, and also things like, the Black Star Film Festival, which is based in Philly, where I am. And I really try to think about in that chapter what the stories are that Black media makers have told us about what happiness looks like, right? I mean, there's this great quote from Du Bois, I think I lead that chapter with, about it not just being sort of these constrained ideas of the American dream, right? But the ability to live freely, to love freely, I think he says something like stretch one's arms and one's soul, right? That's what happiness looks like. And so in that chapter, I really try to think about how Black media makers have given us a map towards a bigger, better future where Americans could actually be happy, right? And experience joy and embrace complexity and do all these things. So I love that chapter because it comes after, the life and liberty chapter, which have some harder content in them, right?
Yes.
And so I hope that I can tackle both the harder content and also think about some of what is, I think, the dual role of Second Sight in Black media. The first role is the critique. The first role is really tackling this gap. What isn't being addressed? What isn't being covered? Whose lives aren't being valued? How might we expand how we understand life and liberty, and how are there still really severe issues to solve in our country around those, but then also the imaginative power of imagining a future where we have those things, and then we can get to the happiness part. We can get to these visions that we haven't even gotten close to yet, right? But we can imagine.
Let me talk about some media products you mentioned in the book, and so people can understand the idea a little better. So you mentioned the movie Sinners, and you
Yeah.
write about that extensively. Talk about how that is a example of second sight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's so many things about Sinners, and I love, of course, I love talking about Sinners right now because Sinners this year became the most Oscar nominated movie of all time,
Oh,
right?
okay, okay.
Which is
Meaning it had
amazing.
the most Oscar nominations. Is that what? Is that,
Yeah, exactly.
that's right. Yeah.
It received the most Oscar nominations of any film ever,
Wow. Okay. Okay.
um, which is remarkable. So yeah, I talk about Sinners because Sinners is an example where Ryan Coogler is a contemporary filmmaker compared to his predecessors. He has you know relatively an extremely he has much more freedom. He has much more economic support and power, but he still faces some of the same challenges in telling stories that center African American second sight. And so the film itself, of course, centers that second sight because, ostensibly it's a film about vampires, but anyone who's seen it knows that it's a film about dispossession, um, about the sort of the stealing of Black culture, of the spirit of Black tradition, and the violence, the real violence that is typical, whether it's, the scenes about sharecropping, the very remarkable monologue in it about lynching, right? And so at the same time, he's using the speculative form and the horror form of the vampire to give us an allegory that can better help us understand what the
Mhm.
Black experience has been in the United States, which is a bit of a vampiric one in
Right.
terms of our relationship to the nation, right? And so this is the ways that he, embodies this in the film itself, in writing the film itself. But the film is also a great example of the ongoing challenges that Black media makers face, even in this era where they receive great recognition. Because he talks in interviews, and I interviewed dozens of contemporary Black media makers for the book, as well as doing the historical and archival work. And Ryan Coogler has talked about the fact that, Sinners was really the project he really wanted to make. He made this incredible independent film, Fruitvale Station, about the murder of Oscar Grant by BART police in Oakland. It was this remarkable, well received, independent film. But that film, he couldn't get the kind of funding and support from, uh, the Hollywood studios to make a film like Sinners at that point, even though he had made this beautiful, remarkable film. Because there are biases built into all of these industries, whether it's journalism or film or anything else. They say, is this, will mainstream
Mainstream.
audiences want this? Will this sell? Is it worth investing in? And, we know we could get into a political, economic conversation
Yes.
for the rest of our time if we wanted to about
Yes.
where the money's coming from and how much folks in media are dependent on that, right? And so Ryan Coogler has said essentially that he had to make the Black Panther movies and he had to make the Creed movies and prove, right, that he could be a box office hit, that he could make box office hits that made a lot of money before he could make a film like Sinners, which is really sort of his heart project, right? Because the only way for him to get the funding and the studio support for Sinners was to make these other big box office hits. And of course, I get into the book how there's a bit of a double standard there because, most white filmmakers don't have to make a movie like Black Panther, which was, I believe, the highest grossing Marvel film at the time that it came, like up to the time that it came out, in order to be taken seriously for funding for another
Right.
movie, right? They don't have to do quite so much overachieving. And so yeah, there's multiple ways where his experience as a filmmaker, which he also talks about being really influenced by the folks that came before him, like John Singleton and Spike Lee and Gina Purse Bythewood, is this pull through legacy of Black media making and Second Sight.
So talk about Du Bois himself. He is an intellectual, but he's also in some ways a magazine editor, is like actually literally true. So talk about that. Talk about that role of Second Sight.
Yeah, I love this. I hope people. I'm a nerd, so and I'm always happy to talk about Du Bois or honestly any of the folks in the book. But people understand and know Du Bois as this really um foundational thinker across a few fields, sociology, primarily in the United States, but also across theories of, identity and difference, of race, of propaganda, right, and so forth. Um, in fact, if you want to nerd out later, we can talk about how Du Bois was one of the first people to use the concept of misinformation in his writing. But
Really, okay.
um, Du Bois was also a media maker. And this kind of goes back to your earlier question about why I use this expansive framework of media making. Because, yes, Du Bois was the editor of the Crisis magazine for several decades, which was the NAACP's magazine, and oversaw what he really understood as a project of positive propaganda in countering the denigrative representations of African Americans in this country, and also engaging in a lot of really heated, sometimes political debates about things like, whether Black men should join the military, and things around housing and housing segregation and so forth. And he was this very fiery, very fiery editor. He, of course, in that regard, was a journalist. He also often wrote editorials for Black newspapers and so forth. But he also was a creative. He also, a lot of people don't know, Du Bois also wrote speculative fiction. And again, I think this goes back to why I use this broader term of media making, because I think we would be doing Du Bois himself a disservice if we just said, oh, he was a scholar and a journalist, or he was a scholar and an editor, or he was a scholar and an activist, because Du Bois was also writing kind of kooky, honestly, speculative fiction throughout his life.
I've not read any of that.
And
It's interesting. I knew that he read, but I didn't know. I've not read any of the
yeah, I
books,
mean, it's
obviously. Yes.
fun if you can get your hands on it. It's kind of fun to think through, like, what he's thinking when he's writing this stuff. Alien invasions, all kinds of things in his
Okay.
in his writing. Um, and he was also supporting multiple types of media projects across different media projects. And so one example of that was that when Paul Robeson was blacklisted during the McCarthy era, Du Bois was an ally of his, and helped to found an alternative radical Black newspaper called Freedom, which Paul Robeson and his wife, Zlonda Robeson, edited and ran. And this was a really sort of, at that point, Du Bois had actually stepped down from working at the Crisis because it had taken on a more conservative bent. And Du Bois, over the course of his life, became more and more politically radical.
Right.
And so, anyways, yeah, you see this in his own work, how he's constantly um, sort of engaging in media and in these different ways. And you find this around a lot of different figures who you think what they did. Like Gordon Parks is a great example. Gordon Parks, incredible photographer, really, I mean, quite literally, right? Because he worked for Life magazine, helped to shift American consciousness about what American life looked like, how expansive it was, what Black life looked like in particular, both the beauty and the nuances and the hard things and all this, all of these things. But what a lot of people don't know about Gordon Parks, and that I actually was thrilled to learn, was that Gwen Parks was now, I think, the artistic director for the first when Essence magazine, which is a women's, a women's magazine focused on Black women, fashion, style, women's issues, etc. He was one of the founding, powerhouses behind the founding of that magazine, right? He also made documentary films, right? He also made one of the first, what is now called blaxploitation films. And I would argue that a lot of the blaxploitation films that came after tried to do what Parks did, in the blaxploitation genre and never quite got there, right? And so, he was doing a lot of different types of media. He was a media maker, just like, Du Bois or, Ida B. Wells or you or any folks that are kind of working across registers and across technologies.
Let's talk about the Code Switch podcast for NPR. I think people will know what that is already who are listening. So talk about that as an example of second sight. I think that's just because it's something very contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you'll allow me to do a small a shout out here, Gene Demby, who is one of the founders of the Code Switch podcast, and remains one of the hosts, and it's been long running now, will actually be in conversation with me about the book in Washington, D.C. this Friday for
Oh, that's
Juneteenth.
great.
So for folks in Washington, D.C., Gene Demby and I will be at Solid State Books this Friday to talk about this book. So yeah, but uh, Code Switch is a great example of what happens when Black media makers actually are able to integrate Second Sight into these more mainstream spaces like
Right.
NPR. And the story behind it is really a great story because it shows the networks and the development of Second Sight as a collective. So the story here is that Gene actually was a blogger. He founded a blog called Post Bougie, and it was in the Black blogosphere era. And it was, leading up to before Obama was elected the first time. So before 2008, he had his blog Post Bougie, and Post Bougie was of this really vibrant space in the Black blogosphere where a lot of people who then you wouldn't have heard of, but now you have heard of, were engaged in these kind of political debates about race in America and politics and Blackness and
Kind of most famously Jamel Bowie, I guess, right?
Jamel Bowie wrote for Post Bougie. I mean, the list could go on and
Yes.
on.
Let's
There's
name
many
people. Yeah.
people who have associations with Post Bougie. I list them all
Yes.
in the book. They ended up being editors at the Los Angeles Times. They ended up, going on to do all kinds of things. But this was really a vibrant space for what we might now call like the elder millennial or younger, you know, um,
Gen Z.
um,
Gen
Gen
X.
X
Yes. Yeah.
cohort of Black media makers who couldn't find a voice in the mainstream media that continued to kind of exclude their voices, but were engaged in the blogosphere. And what happened was this moment opened up where when Obama was elected, all of a sudden, all these mainstream, historically white media spaces said, oh, we need these young, vibrant Black voices to explain, this young, vibrant Black president to us.
Right. Right.
And so people like Gene Demby and many of the other people, Jamel Bowie and others, um, were able to break into mainstream media. Gene first worked at the Huffington Post, and he worked at the New York Times, and then eventually he went on to co-found the podcast Post Bougie with Shireen Marisol Meraji. And I want to point out, Shireen, who was the other co-founder of Post Bougie, is Iranian and Puerto Rican American. So you can be a part of Second Sight. You can be a part of uplifting, alternative narratives and stories. You don't have to be Black, right?
Right. Right.
This is a sort of political and cultural project of telling bigger, better stories about the nation. But to this day, the podcast continues to interrogate both American politics and American culture through the lens of race centrally, right? And insisting on race being a foundational way of understanding our nation. And that is simply something that has been absent largely from public radio, mainstream radio, and so forth, until we got this crop of shows. And, there's a lot of other now people will know, Black podcasts and Black radio shows. I interviewed other folks in the book from various ones, including folks like Eric Eddings, and many others. But yeah, that's a great kind of story of how this happens. Now, of course, there's a lot of challenges along the way. I kind of
Yes.
told the triumphant version of this, but yeah, it's a great podcast to this day.
We should emphasize, and you talk about this book, we're not saying there's one single second sight, right? Stephen A. Smith and Adam Sir are writing and are doing different kinds of media and with different kinds of views. The Kevin Hart roast on Netflix was a kind of media I'm not necessarily a huge fan of it. So let's discuss like how the diversity of the second
Yeah.
sight, so to speak.
Yeah, okay. So I really appreciate that you asked this question because this is a very important nuance that I want people to understand about my argument here. This is not a racial essentialism argument. This is not an argument that all Black Americans think the same or agree on politics, are participating even necessarily in the same political project. In fact, I would argue that there are some people who are outside of this project, right? My book really traces the folks who have a shared sense of one, wanting to improve American democracy through the stories they tell, whether that's through film or through journalism, right? And of two, Black freedom, right? A commitment to what Black liberation or Black freedom, and an understanding that imagining a freer nation will make us all better. So, of course, there are many people who are not in the book, right? And I hate to call out names, but since you called out names, I want to give some examples. Candace Owens is an African American. She is not engaged in a collective project of political second sight, right? There is a political valence to being part of this project that involves being in community and in earnest and honest debate, even across difference or disagreement in community, around issues that have to do with the liberation of Black people, the end of things like, police brutality and so forth. She's not really a part of that, right? And so that's a great example of how, just because someone's Black and they're a media maker, right? It doesn't necessarily mean they're making media that reflects this Du Bois's concept or political concept of second sight, right? That's a perfect example. But there is immense amount of diversity within and how, Black people engage in these projects. And I try to show this in the book through, thinking about the historical Black press. I mean, the historical Black press, there were always Black radicals, who were really engaged in, radical projects around labor, around anti-militarism, around Black power, and so forth, who were part of the Black press. And often the owners and editors who were Black of Black newspapers were more conservative. They often came from families that were part of the Black bourgeoisie, and they tended to often be more conservative, and sometimes they were itchy about, certain things. But what I show in the book is that this actually provided a really generative, people talk about now how we need to hear different views and, be exposed to like different ideas. But if you looked at the editorial pages of a Black newspaper, you would see the Black radicals and the Black conservatives debating each other in the editorial pages, right? You would see the editor and the fiery, young reporter arguing. And I want to say Black newspapers always included white writers as well. There were many, in fact, many Jewish American writers wrote for Black newspapers at different periods of time, who were also engaged in, questions around labor and inequality and other things in their work. And so it's very similar to, the HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, the Black churches, where yes, there is often, especially in the leadership positions, a more conservative valence, but that sort of protects the radicals in their midst in a way that, because it's an internal community debate, they can really be engaging kind of across registers in a way that it's understood that everyone shares an interest in Black liberation, even if they, think the means or the goals are different. So yeah, absolutely, people aren't speaking in one mind, but I do try to show in the book how people, even when they're critical of each other, and some of the contemporary folks I interviewed were critical of other contemporary folks I interviewed, right? So even when they're critical of each other, they assume that people are also interested in this greater project of expanding democracy and of Black freedom. And so there's an earnestness in the engagement and debates that is actually, quite generous in my opinion, for the most part. Now, again, like I said at the start, there are a few people they fall outside of this.
We'll discuss Stephen A. Smith offline. Talk about. You said it's not racial essentialism. I think it was important to say, but I mean, so could you imagine a book about the second sight that Native American media makers or
Yeah.
Latino media makers or female media makers have? This is not saying that Black people have some original insight that no, or we have insight above others, right?
Well, I mean, I do think Black people have some original insight because
Original is right. Yes.
there's something unique about being Black in America and that experience, for sure. So I would say, but what I'm saying is like obviously not all Black people think the same, right? Or not all Black people apply their racial essentialism at the same. And there are actually, I want people to see this book as kind of an alternative media history of the United States. Um, there are, of course, many other media makers who have engaged in projects to try to make the country better, right? Try to make the country broader, more inclusive, more beautiful, more free. And so, yes, of course, there are other folks, and in the book, I give a few examples actually of white media makers who have allied themselves with Black media makers to sort of show how you don't have to be Black to be a part of this project, right? Like you can uplift. One of the great examples I give in the book is this. I don't know if you've seen the film Sing Sing.
No. Okay.
It's a really great film. It's based on this true story of because I talk about prison media and the newspapers that come out of prisons as being one example of where, unfortunately, because of mass incarceration, Black second sight is also often revealed. But Sing Sing is about a theater project inside the Sing Sing prison where Black incarcerated men sort of learned Shakespeare and performed it and led it. And the filmmakers who made the film are white, but they did this thing that is very easy to do, right? Instead of taking the story, writing it themselves, taking the credit, taking the money, right? Instead of appropriating the story, they actually hired and paid equally the formerly incarcerated men who were a part of this project when they were incarcerated. And they gave an equal share. So the directors, these men who both starred in it and helped to write it, right, and direct it, there was an equal share of the proceeds of the film. And it's actually really unique and really remarkable because that doesn't usually happen. Usually
Well,
the person at the top is being paid more and so forth. And so I write about that in the book as an example of the ways that Second Sight can be supported by anyone in the media industry, right? Anyone in the media industry, I don't know about you, but many of the folks I talk to have white editors, right? Or white bosses. They have to go to white investors to get their films greenlit or whatever, right? But it's not that it's impossible for those folks to understand Second Sight. I mean, they can read my book and then really understand it. But it's that they can make the choice to say, this person's vision, this person's insight, this person's perspective is needed, and I can find ways to support this to expand the kinds of stories that are being told.